Hello and welcome to Table for One. This is episode 28B, bonus content, The City of Kings with Frank West, the designer. Yo, my peoples, what's up? This is Jason. I am flying solo. Yeah. Anthony will unfortunately not be joining us. We'll see you in a couple days, Anthony. He just got caught up in a couple of things. He's doing okay. But I'm here, and I have the pleasure of being joined by a new designer who has a real lot of enthusiasm about his project. So we wanted to have him on and just kind of talk about not only his project. Obviously, we're going to talk about the game called City of Kings, which will be hitting Kickstarter pretty soon. But just talk about. It's always cool to talk with a designer, and just looking at the game, it seems like he has a lot to offer. So say hi to the people, Frank.
Hi guys, thanks for having me here, Jason. It's great to be on your podcast.
All right, thank you very much for making the time. Despite me messing up the fact that daylight savings time is here in the U.S. but not in UK yet.
Soon, it's confusing stuff.
For all the people who are wondering, it's usually a 5-hour time difference, and daylight savings times kind of maintains that in both the countries, but there's a 2-hour lapse. So Frank was good enough to come on an hour earlier to compensate for my lack of attention to detail. So thank you, Frank.
It's no problem. Obviously, America and the UK turn at slightly different speeds, and every so often we have to wait for them to catch up with each other.
That's exactly right. You would think we were on the same Earth, but maybe not so much. Wouldn't you? Okay, so let's just talk. Let's just introduce yourself to the world. So I looked in your BGG page and I saw that I don't see any designs, at least to the public at large. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Introduce yourself as a designer. Maybe you've done some projects, kind of locally. So just, let us know who you are.
Yeah, so I'm Frank, as you said. That's always a good start. And I've kind of been interested in game design all of my life. I guess when I was a child, I used to play a lot of video games, and I'd always be kind of coming up with little ideas of what I could do with those video games. And then for my GCSEs, which is a 16-year-old kind of graphics exam, I built a board game for that. And then at university, I did computer science, and my degree was in general computer science, but my main project, which was the biggest part of my degree, was in AI and how you can introduce AI into kind of static browser games. So when you're kind of dealing with, a system that can't just kind of react on its own, how do you introduce AI to it? And over the years, I just put lots of different ideas together. I worked with a few friends who were building kind of web games and video games, and I worked on those projects with them. And I always kind of wanted to build an MMO RPG, a big, mighty kind of video game myself. And as I'm sure a few people know, that's kind of something quite hard to do on your own. It's quite a big undertaking, and it never really was viable. And then over the years, I really got into board games. I started playing a lot of different board games, and as I played games like Eclipse and Dead of Winter, and more recently the Pandemic Legacy, and all of these different games kind of just said to me, well, what you want to do with a video game, you can kind of do in a board game these days. And that's what led me into kind of designing this first board game. So I guess prior to that, it's all been digital kind of game design.
I definitely sense the video game influence on your game. But before we get into the little bit of the nuts and bolts, tell us a little bit about City of Kings. When Anthony introduced me to the project, the first thing that struck me was, wow, this game is pretty beautiful. Some good artwork and good graphic design that you got going into it. But let us know a little bit about City of Kings and what we can expect to hit Kickstarter in a couple days.
So yeah, I think that the visual side of it is a good point. I mean, whilst obviously the mechanics are kind of the key part of the game for me, when I started this, I wanted to kind of do two projects kind of simultaneously, and one of them was a world building project, and the other one was the game building project. So for the last 2 years, I've been kind of writing stories, writing lore. I've been getting artwork done and creating this kind of big universe. And the big goal is in the next 3 or 4 years to release multiple multiple games all within this universe. So not necessarily expansions, but different games that tell different times and different events that happen. So, for example, the City of Kings is a cooperative 1 to 4 player adventure game. And then I like the idea of kind of doing, some take that games or kind of some deception games, which are taking place at kind of in the prison cells at one point in this world, and like bringing this world to life through different stories.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So you mentioned it was a 1 to 4 cooperative adventure game?
That's correct. And it's a big kind of open world game. So we're talking about you're exploring through a world. You're turning over tiles with a modular board. You're going to be finding resources which you can choose to kind of gather or you can ignore. You'll be able to trade for items. You'll be able to find survivors and do quests. And all of this time, you're going to be gaining experience points and leveling up your character with a huge level of customization. And you'll be encountering creatures that get generated. And there's a very kind of tactical combat system in there, but really it's just this big open kind of RPG, and it's up to you whether you want to go on the kind of adventurous kind of exploring route or the profession route, or whether you just want to go kind of hardcore into the combat route. It's really designed for you to kind of make your own path.
Mm-hmm. So when I looked at the specs for this game, and full disclosure, I have not played it, and I've not played a prototype of it. I'm doing research off of the web, which I was very, very happy to do. And this game looked and felt like an attempt at tabletop Skyrim or some kind of tabletop video game where there's multiple things you're doing at once. So there is the combat, like you were saying, and then there's this land development type aspect to it. So when you flip over the tile, it gives you this bonus or whatever it is, and the land looks different than you did when you began the game. So it's two things you're doing simultaneously. I guess the intention was that we could kind of pick what our emphasis is. Like you kind of have to do everything, but we shape how we do everything. So is that kind
Exactly.
That's what you were going for?
Yeah, completely that. So on your turn, you get 4 actions. You have action tokens, and you have some basic actions you can do, which are moving, exploring. You can attack or heal. You can interact with your current location, or you can kind of do one of your special abilities. And you're really choosing kind of how you want to move around. But whilst you're doing this, you also have workers. So there's kind of a subsystem of kind of worker management, and your workers can move around, and your workers can gather resources. So on your turn, you're kind of choosing between whether you want to use all of your actions on combat, whether you want to use some of them are kind of interacting with the land to kind of achieve things, whether you want to use them on your workers to manage, gathering wood to get more items or build up structures. And sometimes you find when people are playing, as it is a cooperative game, you might have one person who focuses just on worker management. And I've had players who have literally said at the start of the game, I'm just going to leave my hero in the city and I'm just going to play it as kind of a worker game. And then other people come in and say, I hate worker stuff. I just want to use my hero. So I'm going to focus really heavily on kind of combat. And the game was really designed so different types of players can kind of come together and choose their strengths and experience the kind of game they want to play whilst in this kind of cooperative environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what I also liked is that the way you approach it is through this very robust character customization system, probably more than I've seen in other games. Like there's character customization in a lot of games, but that usually takes the form of I add this card to my deck, or I, boost this one number by 1 or whatever it is. You have all these little bits, and there's all these little, blocks that go on various parts of your character. It's not even a sheet. It's just kind of this big panel. And so it reminds me of, you were saying like the big MMO. It reminds me of when I used to play Warcraft, and there'd be this tech trees, right? So I had my little priest, exactly. And I had the holy priest, my holy spec, my shadow spec, and it was all these, like I had, I spent hours, like literally hours. I know it sounds so dorky, but I don't care. I'm a dork. I spent hours looking at researching online for different specs of holy priest and who's using this skill now, whatever it is.
Did you have a spreadsheet as well, or were you just reading? I had a spreadsheet where I put the numbers in and try and work it all out as well.
I never got, that was like the theory crafting part of it. I was very derivative, and I looked at other people's spreadsheets and I'm like, oh, okay, they buffed this thing behind the scene and now my gear has more haste and whatever it is. So I wasn't as cool as all that to be on the bleeding edge of theory crafting, but I did a lot of reading of other people doing that. and it was a big deal. Like it was part of the game itself. So I mentioned that there in this game, there's the land development aspect, and there's the combat aspect, but then there's the character customization. All three of these things seem like time-consuming aspects of the game, and you partake in that in certain times. Is that kind of what you were going for?
Exactly. And there's different modes of playing the game. So some of them are quicker modes, some of them are longer modes. So the kind of the length of time you want to play for is kind of very much up to you, and you've kind of got options. With the character customization, for me, it was one of the things I said right at the beginning is I want a game that has like real character customization. I don't, as you said, I don't think I've seen another game that has this level of customization. And it's really important to me that as you play the game, you're building your character, you're crafting your own role. And each time you play, you're going to do that in different ways, depending on the kind of environment you're going through, the scenarios you come up with. So you might customize yourself to move really quickly so you can move further on a turn. Or you might increase your range so you can shoot further across the board. But you're not always going to do both of those things. You might increase your healing stat, or you might increase your attacking stat. But overall, you have there's kind of 9 core stats, and there's about 90 points that you can spend amongst those. And in a typical playthrough, you're going to gain somewhere between 20 and 30 points. So you're never going to be able to get, even really a third of the way up those trees. So you're going to have to choose specializations. And then you have the skill tree, which you mentioned. So 12 unique skills for each character. And there are 6 characters in the game. And when you play through, you're only going to be able to choose 3 of those skills. So again, you're going to be choosing skills dependent on what kind of character you've made in this session, but also the kind of the landmarks. So, for example, Valeria, who's one of our Elvish characters, she has the ability to increase her healing stat if she's on a forest. Now, the forest is one of the tiles in the game, and because the tiles are randomly placed, you might find that your forests are in the corners, and having, a bonus healing when you're in the corner and you can't reach very far isn't going to be that great. But if the forests spawn in the middle of the map, then that might become a more powerful ability. So you're kind of crafting your character, and you're looking at the terrain you're finding and the kind of the scenarios you're facing, and trying to craft the kind of solution and the role that you want to play.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so you mentioned you're playing through the game, you're developing things. Is there a sense of campaign mode type progression from game to game where you can maintain a character and you keep him through multiple playthroughs?
So for anyone who's not familiar, the game comes with 7 stories and 9 scenarios. And the stories are kind of the longer, kind of more immersive version of the game. And the scenarios are kind of the quicker, kind of single objective. Like you can just pick them up and play them when you want to. So the stories are the kind of the main bit. And there's 7 of them. And the stories from a narrative point of view do continue on from each other. So they kind of tell a story. And by the time you've got to the end of the 7th story, you kind of would have learned about this world and gone through this kind of journey. Now, the characters themselves, it's not a legacy game. So the progression of your characters does get reset. And this was a deliberate choice because I want people to kind of work out which stories they enjoy the most and then to be able to replay them. So some stories have a bit more emphasis on kind of work and management stuff. Some of them have a bit more emphasis on exploration. Some of them have more emphasis on combat. And by the time you've got through all 7, you effectively kind of have 7 different games that you can choose which one you want to play depending on the mood you're in. But that is kind of expanded upon by the fact that the later stories, we make the assumption that you're going to be more familiar with the game. So you start in kind of harder areas and you can customize your character before you begin. So in the first story, you're going to kind of start at level 1 and you're going to have no stats. But by the time you get to the last stories, the first thing you're going to do is kind of get to choose what stats you want as your character. So whilst it's not continued, as you progress through, you kind of get to the same point you were at previously much quicker.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So then so the video game pedigree of this game really seems to stand out. Like I just look at it and I see my adventures in Azeroth and
Yeah.
The Elder Scrolls universe and all that. As a board game, if you were, let's say someone just comes up and asks you, like, what is this like? Is this like Mage Knight? Is this like Descent? Is this, what do you feel like a good, like, obviously it's not going to be like another game because why make it? But was there like an antecedent that you really said, okay, I really like what they did here?
It's a really interesting question. And there's one that I like to ask people as well. Whenever I do playtests, I always say to people, what games does this remind you of? Because I feel that's really important. And one of the most recent cases of that was Man vs. Meeple. They're doing a video preview of the game and they've been playing through it. And I spoke to them on Skype afterwards and I said to them, what game does it remind you of? And obviously, Man vs. Meeple, you expect they've played quite a few board games over the years. They're quite familiar. And they just turned around and said, Warcraft, Diablo, and Dark Souls. Yeah. And I was like, any board games? And they're like, well, there's a lot of video game stuff in there. And I think that, in its essence, this game is like more familiar to video game players than board game players. But with that said, a lot of playtesters, I've had people say that for them it's kind of a Mage Knight replacement. They find it's kind of similar to Mage Knight, but they prefer it for various reasons. I'm sure other people would not prefer it for various reasons, right. So I don't want to put like too much of a push on that.
That's the number one solo game ever, buddy. That's his high praise.
I know a few people who like Mage Knight's been a big game for them, and I've got them in to play it for that reason, and they have very much enjoyed it. A few people have mentioned Descent, but it's not quite got that kind of dungeon crawl kind of nature to it. It's a bit more of an open world, and some of the games that come up a bit more often are things like Legends of Andor and kind of Runebound and those kind of games. Mm-hmm. But the kind of this is a slightly more Euro take on that kind of experience. So with those games, they're kind of a more simplified, there's a lot of kind of randomness involved. Whilst in this, it's a much more kind of thinking game. It's a much more tactical game.
Okay. So let's change gears a little bit. We've talked about mechanics. I like to talk about theme. So you mentioned before that this was a world that you're developing. You plan on developing a number of different games, different experiences within this world. Tell us a little bit about what makes this. I mean, we know it's a fantasy world, but what makes this world unique? There are so many takes on fantasy, right? You got Terranoth, you got Middle Earth, you got Eberron if you're a D&D player. There's so many takes on it. What angle were you going for with this theme?
Okay, so I'm going to start with a really big kind of overview first. So one of the things that's really important is there's about a 15,000 year timeline for this world. And throughout that timeline, things change a great deal. So the City of Kings game, which is where I'll focus my answer, is kind of towards the end of that timeline and towards the kind of, the now time, for want of better words.
Because it's already, it's like post-apocalypse. I think there's like this big world-shattering event and you're recreating. Did I get that right?
Yeah, exactly that. So about 50 years ago, this man called Vesh effectively gained this power, and he hid away and created these creatures. And in this world, there weren't really things like orcs and trolls, and they've all been created. And there's a slightly more kind of, I don't want to say like realistic twist to it, but a lot of the stuff is slightly more than just magic. So he's kind of created these creatures through a form of magic and kind of DNA manipulation, and he's used them to effectively just wipe out the whole planet. Like, no one was expecting it. These armies just marched across and destroyed everything. So at the point in the game, all the cities, all the civilization have been destroyed, all the forests have been burnt, all of the lakes have kind of dried up, apart from one small area, which is called the Aegis Realms, which is where the City of Kings is. And the armies are kind of marching across, heading towards this last location. And only a few hundred people have really survived, and they've all kind of retreated back to the city. And really, this is a world where creatures are kind of like these weird mutations of things. They're not just, it's not like you're going to find 50 orcs and they're all orcs. You're going to find orcs that have 3 arms, or orcs that kind of, have wings. And there's all sorts of hybrid combinations of creatures. And basically, the world's destroyed, and all of the characters are broken, and they've all got kind of different issues that have arisen over the years. But more importantly, the races, we kind of built the world on this kind of three-tier system. So we had humans because I wanted to keep a connection to fantasy and to kind of what people expect. So humans are kind of what I refer to as tier 1. We then had tier 2, which is the elves and dwarfs. And we wanted to keep these within the kind of the realms of what people would believe, but kind of expanding them out a little bit in a realistic way. So our dwarfs are kind of the evolution of underground animals. So they've kind of evolved from kind of rats and moles. And whilst they're still kind of what you'd see as a dwarf, their skin is more of a leather, their hair is more of a fur, and they can see well underground, but they don't see well above ground. And they have this kind of slight adaptation to them. Whilst the elves are kind of zombie-like because they're in touch with nature and all of nature is effectively being destroyed. And whilst they're not dying, their flesh is kind of rotting and they're kind of withering away, and they don't want to be seen by people because, they're not these beautiful creatures they once were. And then we have kind of tier 3, which is the creations that we came up with. So we have the Vedora, which is a bird type race. We have the Risen, which is a rock and tree type race. And we have the Sakura, which are kind of a desert cat-like race. But when I say cat, I mean more kind of mountain lions and kind of wild cats rather than the kind of the cute fluffy house cat.
Fear the house cat.
Yes, exactly. But a lot of the inspiration's been taken from kind of animals and kind of, as I said earlier, the real kind of life kind of stuff. We didn't want it just to be like, this is all magical make-believe. And we've tried to use, my partner, Sarah, my girlfriend, was a biologist. So we spent a lot of time making sure that she was happy that these things made sense and they weren't just kind of weird rules that I had made up.
So when you described the world, I immediately thought of, have you read the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson?
I haven't. I'm aware of it, but I've not read it.
The way that that world is set up is very similar in that there was this, it's a bunch of races, but then this one character. I'm not going to spoil the books or anything, but one, basically there's an apocalypse that happens, right? And the apocalypse is centered around this one guy that's kind of like reshaping things, but he's doing kind of he's doing some kind of job where he's not doing it to the benefit of everybody, and things become ruined. And rain is like now ash, and and volcanoes are just like erupting, and the land is bleeding, and all the cities become like really disconnected from one another, it's not. I don't think it goes into like much of the animal life, but like the humanoids out there are like these mutated, blobby things, and they're they have like weirdo intelligence. They're not like human. They're humans, but they're not. All that kind of stuff. So it definitely kind of like plays on that post-apocalyptic dystopian type atmosphere. It really, what you're describing sounds a lot like that. Only in the Mistborn world, there's basically no grass. There's basically no greenery. Sounds like in your world, at least a little bit of that has, what am I saying? Lasted after the post.
Yeah, it's kind of that the last step just before that kind of final destruction. And you're kind of, this first board game, you're kind of in that story of, are we going to be able to find a way to fight back, or are we going to end up in that state?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the apocalypse is ongoing.
Yeah, it's never going to end.
Okay, so and that's kind of your role, and that's where the I guess the terraforming part of the game comes. You're like resisting, what is happening to the world and trying to create and make it beautiful again.
Exactly. I mean, the start of the kind of first story is very much, the last kind of people have kind of got back to the city, and you've just had this discussion of, are we just going to sit behind this door and wait for the armies to get here, or are we going to try and find some way to kind of push back? And you're kind of exploring back out. And whilst the lands might be familiar, because these kind of enemy creatures are kind of taking over, things are kind of changing, and you're not quite sure what's going to be where. And you're on that kind of final line.
Mm-hmm. And so an easy question that a designer gets asked a lot is, what came first, the mechanics? But it really, right? But it sounds like one leading to the other, leading back to the one, leading back to the other. So you started making a big MMO video game, which is more of a mechanic side thing. But sounds like you really put a lot of thought into what you want this world to feel like, and what you want the history to be, and all that kind of stuff. And it seems like it's fed back into the mechanics. Is that kind of, did you feel that as an organic process in your design?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I often refer to it as kind of world first, which I kind of see as, the next step up beyond kind of a theme. But it's a really interesting kind of scenario. So a good example of this is I mentioned earlier Sashara, who's kind of this kind of cat ninja stealthy like character. And when we were designing her and drawing her, we felt like the picture was, or the painting, I should say, was a little bit kind of single colored. We're going down this concept of like every character has 3 core colors, and we were trying to work out what we could do. And from a game perspective, I was trying to come up with this idea that each character had their unique skills and they had their own kind of traits. And whilst they're all, able to do everything, they had their personal styles and ways of doing things. So I was trying to like go back and forward, and I was like, well, what could we do? And we looked at the picture and we looked at this, and I was talking with someone who's helping with the writing, and we came up with this idea of poison. And then straight away I was like, cool, she can be the character in the game that does kind of poison abilities, and she can throw poison around. And from a picture perspective, we're like, oh great, so now we can have like green tip blades, and we can have little green vials on her, and and it starts to kind of, they both bounce back off each other with this cool, now we've got mechanics coming from this world, but the world's kind of creating this at the same time. And like the whole lot is a big kind of beautiful harmony, I guess, of they all kind of inspire each other at different times.
That sounds really awesome, and I get it's the best of design, right? When they can kind of both bounce one back and for the other. So I apologize in advance for a little bit of vertigo. We just got into a big theme discussion, but I did want to notice something about the mechanics of the game that you have set up. So your approach to randomness is pretty interesting. So there's actually a lot of randomness. I'm gonna go a little bit ludology on you. It's what's called like input randomness. So like a lot of randomness goes kind of into what you're encountering. So the tiles are laid out randomly, the land tiles, and then creatures, when they come out, you draw like these traits out of a bag, and you assign the certain traits to the creature. So kind of like you might get like a cow, not a cow, that's not a terrifying creature, but like,
be careful of that cow, you don't know what it's going to do.
You pulled out like it has claws and it has machine guns and so well, I mean, it could be anything, right? So it could be a bear comes out and then it has these traits which you've pulled randomly from a bag. Again, randomness, but your approach to combat is pretty deterministic. Like either you're stronger or you're not. So is that something that you put a lot of thought into, like how you want randomness to play out in your game?
Yeah, completely. It was, as I'm sure you can imagine, it was like the hardest thing to get right with this game, to balance and to kind of get the right feel to it. I had this concept of what I refer to in probably the non-technical term of random generation for deterministic solutions. And the theory behind it was, I want a game that every time you play it is completely different. I'm not talking about, you might get a card in a different order. I'm talking about like the world is different. What you encounter is different. You're going to have infinite kind of replayability of completely different scenarios. But whilst you're playing it, I don't want it to feel like it's random. I want you to feel like you're coming up to puzzles and you can sit down and work out solutions. And really it's about kind of efficiency and choosing paths and taking risks and deciding when the right time is to do what things. So you might have a creature on the board that might be too tough for you now. So then you've got that question of, do we do a quest to try and get stronger, or do we explore another tile? But that tile might be a creature. Or do we go and gather some resources? But if we spend time gathering resources, then the time in the day, so the game has this kind of clock that spins round, and after a certain amount of days, you lose. So you have kind of a time limit. So you've got to kind of find the most efficient route to do what you're trying to do. And sometimes you'll take risks. So in the game, there's no player elimination. Your characters, if you die, similar to any MMO, they'll get kind of rushed back to a specific location, they'll come back to life, and they'll be able to continue playing. But you can only do that 3 times in the game. So if you die a 3rd time, then the game ends. But again, you'll find some creatures, you'll be like, well, if you stand in front of it and let it attack you and you die, then we'll be able to attack it from behind and kill it. Mm-hmm. But do we want to risk our life now, or do we want to wait until later? And whilst you can see these kind of options, you're making these kind of choices about where to take risk, where to play it safe, when you kind of, want to like beat up against that fear and say, we're going to flip that tile, or we're going to take on this next creature. And it's really interesting kind of watching people play, because whilst it's very deterministic, you see people with these kind of always coming up with decisions, and those decisions are constantly changing the parameters. So you're never really sure what's going to happen, even though you can always see all of the options, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Like it's a difference between, so you're playing a game, let's say you're playing like Rootmound or something. Rootmound is very dice driven, or Descent or something like that. Like you're figuring out if you're going to attack that monster, and you already have what you're going to have. Like you're not going to have more resources. The question is, are you going to roll well enough? And that might not be an exciting choice for a strategic player, because it's kind of out of your control. But if your resources, what's available to you, like if you know what the outcome is going to be, but then what's available to you is a little bit random. So like you were mentioning before, that tile might have the thing I need, or it might make things worse.
Yeah, exactly.
Or or like you were saying, you take the safer route. Let's get some resources and make sure I can increase my ability to beat this thing. It may be a little bit slower than if I kind of risked it or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, you know what is going to happen when you kill that creature or not, and your choices are kind of shaped around that. Which means, so what happens is, like, you make that choice, and even if you don't get what you want, you've made some kind of progression, right? So,
Exactly,
that tile has been turned over. That wood has been gathered. So when you're just approaching a monster and you roll dice at it and you fail, then you've made no progression.
Exactly. And these creatures, like just the people, like when the creatures spawn and they get their abilities, those abilities really decide everything. So if a creature doesn't get a movement ability, it's going to stay on the same tile. If it doesn't get a healing ability, it's never going to heal itself. So you're going to find that some creatures, they'll specifically generate, and they'll be very strong and very powerful, and you won't be able to kill it, but it will just sit in the corner of the board and it won't chase you. It won't attack you until you go up to it, but it takes over that part of the board. So then your decisions become, at what point do we start entering there? At what point do we come back and face it? And you see these kind of creatures, and some of them will be on the board for, 20 minutes or 25 minutes. And every so often you'll kind of attack it once as you kind of go past, and then you'll kind of run away again. And you're making all these kind of decisions about, when do we approach stuff? So again, it's not a game where you're going to fight kind of hundreds of creatures and all the creatures are going to be the same. In a typical playthrough, you might only encounter between 8 and 10 creatures, but each of them are going to require their own kind of form of you being able to defeat it. And that might involve kind of teamwork, it might involve using the land, it might involve kind of powering up, but like there's always these endless kind of decisions that you kind of are faced with.
Mm-hmm. So I think that we've covered a lot about City of Kings, unless there's something else that you wanted to share with the audience about the game that they should know.
No, honestly, I think for me, I always say, obviously the world, the character customization, the kind of the worker management, and the creature generation and combat are kind of the main topics. And I think we've gone through all of those in quite a lot of detail.
And definitely, for me, I'm more of like a bigger picture guy. So like the pedigree of the game is, this is a video game on a board. This is you strive to be unlike different, board games that are usually doing their thing. Like you see I'll be honest, the first time I saw this, I'm like, okay, big adventure game. I've never seen that before. Meanwhile, I've seen it 100 times. So
yeah.
I went into it looking, what's different about this game, but it really is like, it is doing a lot of different stuff. It like the fact that it's weaving together character customization and exploration, and that gives me that Elder Scrolls on a board kind of vibe. I think you have at least accomplished what our listeners would want to know, which is, why is this game different? Why should I look at this? And then they can make the decision to back or not from there.
No, I'm glad you kind of say that, and it's been really interesting with play testing because I've specifically tested with kind of three core groups. I've tested with people who are D&D players to kind of check for the kind of role playing nature of it. I've checked with typical kind of board game players from light games up to heavy games, and then I've also done play testing with video gamers who have never played board games, and we're talking haven't even played Catan, and all three groups have managed to play the game, and they all approach it in very, very different ways, but they all kind of can get through it. And it's really surprising to me, to be able to watch video gamers take on a game that kind of from its looks is quite complex, but because they're used to that video game kind of scenario, they can get through the game very easily. Whilst board gamers kind of understand the mechanics a lot more and they can kind of get on that board, but they're not so used to kind of the strategy side of it. And it's really intriguing to watch how those two different groups kind of play the game in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I did forget to ask, we are a solo games podcast, so I should probably ask, how does this game work as a solo?
So the game works with you controlling multiple hands, so you'll be controlling either 2, 3, or 4 characters.
Okay, so basically like co-op rules, there's no special automa deck or like any of the strategies that other games use to kind of make the solo different. This is basically a pure co-op, and you could just go in there and, without too much fiddling and play it solo just fine, right?
Exactly. I actually spent quite a lot of time trying to design a specific solo experience for it. But I found each kind of route I went down actually ended up with kind of a less interesting game, because when you're doing things like combat, there's a lot of kind of tactics and kind of thinking about position of characters and how they relate to each other. And again, with that kind of, if one's tanking and absorbing damage and another one's healing and another one's attacking. And when you kind of end up with that, well, I've got one character that's either automated and therefore, I'm forced down this certain route, or I'm controlling one character that's doing all of those roles. It kept taking away that experience. And eventually I ended up with playing 2 characters it works quite well, and I enjoy it personally and hope that other people will kind of come to the same conclusions.
Well, solo players who've played, Descent and all those other, we're used to controlling 2 characters, so that you're not asking too much of the peoples there. So that's good. That's good to know. So can you see further ahead? I mean, or is the looming, how will this game do is just kind of encompassing everything? Well, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is like, can you see other games? Like, I know you mentioned like the backstabbing and the bluffing, but are you starting to really design in that space, or are you just like, oh my God, I need to just figure out if this one's going to work or not?
Yeah, so I'm someone who I spend a lot of time progressing ideas in my head before I decide whether or not they're suitable. So I come from a kind of a development world and a logic world, and I can kind of play test games in my head and kind of get an idea of whether I feel they're going to work. So I typically, every week will have 2 or 3 ideas, as I'm sure everyone else does as well. And at the moment I have 3 other games which are at a point where they're kind of early prototypes, where I really feel that those 3 games actually all have something and I kind of want to work with them. But they're all at a point now where they need some kind of proper play testing, and I really wanted to wait until the campaign launched so I can kind of put a bit more time into that. And also I want to kind of build an audience over time for those people to kind of get to know the kind of games I want to make. And until this first game's kind of been through Kickstarter and I've got to know the kind of people who are interested in that game, it's a lot harder to kind of judge which of those 3 games would be the right next game to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. That sounds like really smart. So, I mean, I hope that this podcast kind of opens the door to, opens you to the gamers that will connect with this game, and hopefully allows the gamers who are looking at this a little bit more access. So, we'll just put it out and see what happens.
No, great. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been great chatting through it. And hopefully at least one person's learned something about the game that they find interesting, which, that's the goal of this. So.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's going to wrap it up. This is, I have been very, very lucky in this to be joined by Frank West, the designer of City of Kings. This was a really good conversation. Thank you, Frank, and we wish you the best of luck on the Kickstarter.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate it.
All right, this is going to wrap it up for the bonus content for Table for One. You can find us at all of the usual spots on social media. You can find us at BoardGamersAnonymous.com, on Twitter at BGA Podcast, and you can find us also poking around the solo Facebook guild. So, I'm just going to wrap it up over here. Later, everybody.